On the 16th of November, a European fashion brand called Balenciaga posted a series of images on social media which started to go viral. They showed images of children holding toy bears. The toy bears were wearing what can only be described as sexualized clothing. The images quickly took hold online as the images were shared by people across social networks. Shortly after, the company deleted all the images, but the damage had been done. The ball had started rolling. TV channels joined the growing uproar, and then things got worse. People noticed in a second earlier campaign, the pictures showed a handbag sitting on top of court documents. And when people zoomed in on the text in those documents, it revealed that they were papers from a US Supreme Court ruling related to indecent images of children. But it still got worse. Images on the wall showed drawings of children, which some found unsettling. Now, Balenciaga removed the campaigns and started to release statements, as you would expect. They said the choice of clothing items should not have been featured with children. The company said the two separate ad campaigns in question reflected a series of grievous errors for which Balenciaga takes responsibility. The company said it was carrying out investigations and strengthening checks and controls around its creative processes. They also said they'd launched legal action in respect of the first campaign and the photography team over the court documents and the images in that, but not the second one. It added, "We want to learn from our mistakes and identify ways we can contribute." So what went wrong, and what could or should they have done? As a former journalist for many years, this is a goldmine of a story, and I know how I would have handled this from a press point of view. But let's try and put aside the moral arguments for a moment here, as this is a podcast about public relations, so that we can look at this as coldly as possible. This is obviously an enticing news story. There's no getting around for that, for both traditional media and for social media. It's got shock factor, it's got children, it's got fashion labels going too far in an industry where boundaries are often being pushed to the absolute limits. It's got rich people wearing expensive clothes, being embarrassed, parents trying to protect their children, being offended and fearful over sexualization. It's a goldmine of a news story, especially for media focused on pushing family values. So if you want to use labels like this, you could say the right-wing media, where it's more traditional values, tend to focus on things like this. It's got everything it needs to make a story go truly viral. So what could or should Balenciaga have done? And I would love your thoughts on this. As always with Crisis PR, there's so many different ways of approaching it, but I would love to know how you would have approached this too. More on that actually a little bit later on. But let's talk about how I think I would have approached this. When the story first broke, Balenciaga appeared to go on the attack, talking about legal action, which was an interesting choice. It was hard to know whether they had sanctioned the images themselves or not internally from what they were saying at that point. But let's face it, for folks interested in PR like you and me, it is hard to believe that these images were just released without any form of checking. These sorts of things normally go through a series of approval processes. Now, of course, we don't know exactly what happened. We probably never will, but it just felt like that was pushing it too far to imply that this was something that hadn't been sanctioned at some level. So let's take a look at a couple of scenarios here and see what we could have done and how we could have dealt with this. Let's say, first of all, that they really had not been involved in these images and it had been released by some sort of malicious actor or by a photographer or by some campaign or something like this, or some disgruntled employee. Now, it doesn't look like that is the case, but it's an interesting case study and one any organization could face from a malicious employee or a former employee or even some kind of contractor. Now, in which case, they want to say that and say it quickly. Stick to the facts. And you're going to see this is a running theme in my approach to this throughout the rest of this episode. Stick to those facts. Keep it absolutely clear. For example, we did not sanction these images and we are attempting to find out who did. Just like we discussed earlier in the year when I was talking about Will Smith in the infamous Oscars fiasco, The Punch, then you want to go quiet. Don't do any media interviews until you are sure what happened. Don't respond to questions or get involved in debate. Then wait for the noise to die down a bit, addressing only any new key themes which start to gain traction, which are pure myths, and answer them with a very short, sharp fact. Don't go into discussion, don't go into debate, don't waffle around it, as I'm about to say in a moment. Okay, so what about what appears to have happened? That someone somewhere messed up. If we look at Balenciaga's initial comments, ignoring the threat of legal action, and they used a fairly commonly used story response in this sort of thing. They said they need to review what happened and then make clear that they condemn child-related crimes and activities. And as I say, this is a very common structure to use for business and government in PR. The two-part statement of we condemn X to head off that running theme that's starting to build, and we are reviewing. In other words, we don't have the answers yet, but we're looking into it. As I say, it's really important to stick to the facts. They could have claimed they knew nothing about it, but the problem with lying in the modern era is that the truth would eventually come out. Now, this might have been possible 20, 30 years ago to get away with for fudging something and claiming something that wasn't true. But these days, it's going to come out at some point, whether it's from someone internally or from just a slip of the tongue from anyone involved in the organization. So the next step then is to go quiet and not say anything until you know exactly what happened. Now, you can see that some of those involved in this whole story started to do this. They knew that as far as they were concerned, they were not involved. And you can see that one of the photographers, or not a photographer, actually a lighting person involved in one of the photo shoots, stated quite clearly on his Instagram that the subject choice was not something that he had any influence over. He was simply asked to light the scene. So it was quite clear and unequivocal that he was not involved in that choice, that part of it. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone's going to listen when you state your facts, but he was being clear about his position on it. Again, there's no point engaging in debate online or journalist questions. There's a temptation to do that. Remember the pressure of the entertainment press put on Will Smith to speak after the Oscars moment, but you can't win that argument with the press or the people making the noise on social media, so there is no value in trying. Some people might suggest giving some sort of vague statements to try and head off criticism, saying something a bit more fluffy. But one of the problems of trying to fudge an issue, and I can speak from experience on this, is if you fudge or try to spin blatantly, not only does it leave space for speculation, but also begs for accusations of failing to respond or deliberately trying to mislead people. So what do you do when you know the facts? Well, on Friday last week, we can see exactly what Balenciaga decided to do because they started releasing some statements. And it's interesting that it was what I was actually going to predict when I first started writing some notes for this episode. I didn't know they were going to come out with this response in time for this week. So they had a few options if you think about it. They could have made someone fall on their sword and blame them and make them the scapegoat. Certainly in political PR, making someone take the blame who then resigns is often enough to move the story on, as the focus of blame goes with them. This is especially true when you've got a figure who's already prominent in the general press and is likely to continue to be so, something very relevant for politics. For example, if you've got a government minister responsible for health during COVID, and then they do something, then they're going to be in the spotlight every day because journalists are going to be asking questions about that. And if there's some other distracting issue, it's going to distract from that point, and the safest thing for them to do is to go. But I think what Balenciaga have on their side here is the very fickle public perception about fashion. Whatever you think about the morals of the story will fade and in time become just another fashion crisis. But they did still need to do something to try and round this up, and they've taken this sort of semi-fall-on-your-sword approach. As I say, a couple of statements were released on Friday, interestingly at the end of the day on Friday, just before the weekend. Now, while media, of course, today is very much 24/7 now, you used to do this kind of thing to try and bury news. You put it out late on a Friday because the journalists were going off for the weekend, the public were paying less attention to their social media and to the media outlets, and it helped to dampen down the story. So while it's not going to have the same effect as it would have done in the past, it's going to help a little bit. Now, in those statements, the creative director of Balenciaga, Demna, released a statement to say that, "I want to personally apologize for making the wrong artistic choice." It goes on, but the gist of it is that he's taking full responsibility for this. He's the person who made the mistake, except it was a bad choice on his part. So the statement is very factual. It doesn't try to justify anything, as that would just draw more criticism. As I say, it addresses the key concerns, such as the choice of clothing in the images. The idea is to put a line underneath it. And as with Will Smith, he says that he needs to learn now. So it's a standard approach of saying, give me time to sort this out. The idea being to head off the initial criticism and then to try and give the story time to start to go away. At the same time, Balenciaga issued a very factual Instagram update. It was quite interesting in the fact that it wasn't a letter or anything like that. It wasn't written in English. It was simply a series of statements, such as one that really stood out to me, which was Balenciaga has decided not to pursue litigation. In other words, the legal action they were talking about over the earlier campaign. If you think about it, it's understandable why. The damage is done. A court case would simply keep that story alive and repeated over and over again in the fashion world. It would keep all this going on and distract them from moving on. Winning in court over those images would not remove the damage that is done. So what would be the point? So should they respond any more now? No, not in my opinion, unless a myth gains traction, which can certainly happen. In a vacuum, this is the problem. When no one's saying anything, the social media world and the media world will start to come up with its own ideas. Now, if you can disprove that with a very clear one-sentence fact that proves it wrong, then go for it, but don't engage in anything else. The final question I suppose to ask is, could they have prevented this? Well, frankly, let's be honest, it was a bit silly. While pushing the envelope with adults can always draw criticism, this was about children. And what about the court documents? Well, no one knows exactly what happened there. They've dropped the legal action on this, so we're never going to find out in court what exactly happened. But in my time in PR, I nearly released a picture with a newspaper in the background with a very clear headline that said something quite unpleasant. Luckily, someone else spotted it. There were only 2 of us actually working on that at the time, but you get the feeling that at Balenciaga there are more people involved in this process, and they really should have spotted this stuff. So is the damage done permanently? Well, as with all stories like this, while there can be a loud and vocal outcry, the majority of people won't care. Again, putting aside the moral case here, that's the reality, whether it's a fashion story or politics or whatever. The world keeps moving on. It's always looking for the next salacious headline. Now, the firm is bound to see some sort of reduction in sales, but will it be long-term? And crucially, will it be from their customers? The crucial thing now, then, is not to look at the noise or the controversy on social media or in the media, but the sales figures. If their customers stop buying and don't come back, then maybe Demna, the creative director, will need to go. But if not, then maybe it's a question of just keeping their head down for the while until they can start coming back. Certainly their website shows no sign of changing business, and it's business as normal. So here are my observations from all this. Hopefully your organisation is never going to mess up quite like this, but the scenario of bad news going viral is certainly a possibility in this day and age. The first thing is to have a plan and be ready. Now, you can probably guess many scenarios to cope with that come out of the kind of industry that you're involved in. And it's never going to be what you expect when it actually happens. But simply by role-playing is going to really help you know who's going to be responsible, who's going to handle it, who's going to talk to who's going to do the investigation. Practice out some of those scenarios. What will we say if X happens? Stick to the facts. Don't waffle. Don't fudge. Only defend yourself on the things that you can truly stand up for, those factual statements. And if you're going to blame someone else, make sure that you know that you're going to win it and that it's not going to drag out the story even more. Keep the information short, head off the myths with cold, clear facts, keep it tight. Release it also on your own feed. Social media is great. Your social media feeds, don't rely on others to release what you say in full. Often the media will break it down or analyze it. They won't just release a statement as is your full official statement. There's a lot I think we can learn from all this, but what do you think? How would you have handled the Balenciaga affair? What would you have advised them? I would love to know. Message me at info@thepublicrelationspodcast.com, info@thepublicrelationspodcast.com, and if we have a few differing views, we could maybe do a panel discussion on an episode about this in a future episode. As always, all the notes from this episode are in the resources section of the website if you'd like to have a look through there. If you're concerned that you might have to deal with crisis PR at some point, I've got the sort of structure in there going on the website. It's at thepublicrelationspodcast.com. That's thepublicrelationspodcast.com. In the meantime, I'm Richard Midson. I hope you don't have a crisis this week. In fact, I just hope you have an awesome week. I'll speak to you real soon.